What's going on, guys? Andrew and Logan back here from New Bark Network for today's episode of the New Bark News Podcast. What's going on, Logan?
What's up?
Yeah, what's
Oh,
up?
wait, no, I was saying it first. It doesn't matter.
Whatever.
Getting briefed on what's hip and happening with the kids.
Yeah, what are the youths like nowadays when it comes to the games? That's what we have to ask ourselves every.
And that's what we're gonna tell them.
Yeah, we're gonna tell them what
Tell
they
them what
like.
they like.
Yeah, exactly. And what they did like this week are some new game releases. So we had the free version of Dissidia Final Fantasy NT. I don't even know what that was supposed to be. Like, I saw the
I was about
title
to
and I was
say, you
like,
sound like you don't know what it's supposed to be.
yep, I mean, yeah. Like, honestly, Final Fantasy names, when you deal with things like 13-2, that's already intimidating enough for the general public, because what the frack does that mean? And then you throw in this, which is just long and has some letters at the end that don't have a clear abbreviation and everything else, and I'm just like, why? Why?
Because you're not dedicated enough, Andrew.
You're right, I'm not a hardcore enough fan, but that's a thing, and maybe it's good. I don't know. I'm probably not going to play it because I'm playing Final Fantasy 13 right now, and I'm still deciding whether I like it or not.
Nice.
Then we've got Baba Is You for PC and Switch. I'm pretty sure this is that puzzle game where you rearrange the letters to make different rules apply to the screen. So, like, it'll say fire is red, and then you can change red to, like, blue, and then it changes what's going on in the screen and such. It actually looks really interesting by concept if you've seen any of the trailers for it. I may pick it up at some point if it gets a physical release.
Sounds like Scribblenauts and Mario Party got mashed together.
Yeah, that was actually may not be a bad way to describe it. Alrighty, we've got some communist propaganda amongst our releases for this week. We had
Thank God.
we had Workers and Resources, Soviet Republic coming out for PC. Is this like a simulator or something? That's my question.
We have to teach them how to seize the means of production somehow.
Right, you gotta go down with the bourgeois.
Mm-hmm.
Then we had One Piece World Seeker for the PC, Xbone, and the PS4. And every time I see that title, I say, I could watch 1,300 plus episodes, or I could go do something else. And I usually choose the something else. But,
Why?
dang it, somebody actually
See, there's
questioned
no
that.
good reason.
Yeah, go sink 750 hours of
Yep.
your time to
Yep.
watch the 1,300 episodes. I mean, if you're a fan of this, it's probably cool. And if you've been a fan since the beginning, well, then good for you. You've stuck with this franchise and you've shown some marathon levels of endurance, and this is a game for your franchise, one of many. And it may be good, and it may not be good, but I'm not going to play it.
That's justifiable.
Exactly. These are what the Utes are into now, my friend. So as for this week's video game news, and some things that we probably have more to discuss about, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot about the biggest release of this week, Division 2, or should I say the most minor release, because I forgot about it, despite the fact that it's a Tom Clancy game and those usually sell well. I mean, I've heard good things.
My friend plays it.
Yeah, that's kind of our usual answer to this type of If it's not a
It really
5
is.
years old game or
Uh-huh.
older, we haven't touched it. But our friends, thankfully, keep us in the loop on things. Apparently, it lacks much of a story, but the world's cool, and the gameplay is really fun. And yeah, I mean, that sounds pretty standard for a shooter nowadays, to be honest. I feel like very few of them put a whole ton of time into making this stellar story anymore, so...
It's Tom Clancy, so I hope everyone can get up the ladders okay.
Yeah,
That was my
exactly.
problem.
That's actually a genuine clunkiness in some of the older games. The only Tom Clancy game I played in the past was Rainbow Six Vegas, the original one on 360, and I was like, oh boy, this combat's really fun, but some of these ladders and such...
I have one of them on the N64 and I'm too scared to play it.
Yeah, that sounds about right. But the gameplay's really fun. Like, the gunplay system's kind of unique. There's a lot of cover-based combat and such. And the Tom Clancy games started in an era where, like, third-person shooters were often not done super well, especially when it came to creativity of the shooters, so I'll give them credit where it's due. I know a lot of people are super hyped about this game. It sounds like it's living up pretty decently to the hype, so good for those people.
I'll take the stairs.
Yeah, I'll take the stairs this time. And maybe they take the stairs too. As for this week's news, other than the fact that Division 2 came out, we've also got apparently PC games can be streamed to the Xbone now, like via a direct service that Microsoft offers. And
So
apparently,
wait, the other way around. The PC games get streamed to the Xbone.
yes, yep,
Huh.
we went and turned everything on its head this week. So this is interesting because apparently it's also compatible with Steam, but the big feature it's lacking right now is you can only use it via controller. And I know for most of my friends that are hardcore PC gamers, which is probably not the target audience of this anyway, most of them really dislike using a controller. Like, they are hardcore into their keyboard mouse setup. But it's kind of a cool feature. I mean, games like Borderlands 2, most of my friends that I would actually play that with now are PC gamers, so being able to still kind of get my couch type of experience with the big screen TV and such while playing with my friends and not needing to do it via an Xbone is kind of nice.
I definitely would like to try this with Team Fortress 2 at some point.
Ah, there you go. It'll feel just like the classic Orange Box days.
Oh, yes.
I just need to get a computer with a
Oh,
LAN
boy.
cable just to try this out, see how it goes. So Tuesday, apparently, of this week, Behemoth is, in all probability, announcing Castle Crashers coming to the Switch and the PlayStation 4. They put something
Why?
on their... I don't know. That's actually... well, okay, for Switch it kind of makes sense, because Castle Crashers hasn't been available on Nintendo console before, and given the Switch's sort of, like, co-op tendencies and everything, basically how it's pushing for that type of an atmosphere, Castle Crashers leans really well into that. PlayStation 4, it makes sense, I guess, if you're just porting the game. I mean, why not? You'll probably still sell some copies. It's not like the PlayStation 4 lets you always download your old PS3 titles. To be honest, I'm not sure if you can download the PS3 version of Castle Crashers if you bought it to the PlayStation 4 or not, because I know
That's
the
true.
compatibility thing's weird there. So it's, I don't know, it's kind of cool. I got a kick out of this game when it came out, so I think that's not too bad. Especially, like, once more, the Switch, this game goes pretty well with it. It was kind of that tendency Behemoth was going with for a while there with Battle Block Theater and Castle Crashers, of trying to revive some of that old couch co-op type of a vibe for, like, a Saturday morning cartoon beat-em-up style game, which I quite enjoyed personally, but once more, not for everybody. A bit of a slow news week, so the next one we're actually going to talk about is the fact that Sony's releasing a green PlayStation 4 controller. It looks cool. And
Wow!
yeah, I know. Wow, kids, this is the greatest article of all week. No, I mean, to be fair, if you're a PlayStation 4 owner like myself, our controller options right now kind of suck compared to the other consoles. Like, you got blue with some other dark blue that doesn't even, like, contrast it very much for a color choice, and then you got, like, gold with some other off gold on the bottom that doesn't really
So
contrast it.
the green controller isn't made to like culminate or celebrate anything. It's just
No,
it's green now.
it's green now. I mean, Sony, your controllers, they aren't cool. Like, they just aren't. I'm sorry.
Never liked the PS4 controller.
I love the feeling of the controller, just the designs. Like, my Xbox One, when I got it, despite the lack of me using it, they had a slew of really cool controller designs available. The Nintendo Switch, if you name a major Nintendo franchise, they make a pro controller that goes hand in hand with that, and most of the time for pretty cheap too. PlayStation 4, once more, you've got dark blue with some other shade of dark blue on there too that looks kind of bad next to it. You've got red with some other shade of red underneath of it. Just why? Like,
With the Xbone, you can actually customize and like custom order controllers, from what I understand.
yeah, I believe they offer that for PlayStation 4 too, but those end up going in like the $150 to $200 range, which to me is just
Yikes.
insane. Yeah, I know. Like, the only the only PlayStation 4 controller I've seen that genuinely looks really nice, and even then it's not super custom or anything, is the one that comes with the Spider-Man PlayStation 4, because at least the controller itself, when it's going for that solid color type of a feel, is actually a solid color, and then the whites on it complement it really well with the PlayStation 4 system. But still, compared to like the Volcanic Shadow or like the Aqua Shadow or whatever it's called, controller options that have been available on the Xbone for a while now, it's nothing. But the screen looks kind of cool, so I may end up buying it, not gonna lie. I'm a PlayStation guy. Their controllers are bad, and I'll rant about them, and I'll still buy them anyway. Sony, what have you done to me? So for more news, the people, Niantic, who made Pokemon Go, are working on a Harry Potter mobile game. I'm not a mobile gamer, so I want to say I don't care, but it's Harry Potter, and we've yet to really receive many good Harry Potter games. So
I'm neither a mobile gamer nor a Harry Potter fan, so
you
guess
really
what?
don't care.
Yeah.
I mean, I might try it, but most of these games, in order for them to function the way they're intended, especially the Niantic ones, require to use mobile data, and mobile data is expensive, so I'm not
That
going
is
to do
true.
that. So then we've also got kind of the biggest piece of news from this week, which is the Google thing. there's patents for
Ah,
Google's
yes.
controller around, and there's apparently going to be some big announcement next week, and then there's rumors slinging around of them teaming with Ubisoft and Sega for some reason. So, yeah, this kind of brings us to our main topic, because the Google thing's mostly just speculation at this point, and we know there's an announcement coming this week, and that's, if you're trying to dive into the game console market, when should you do it, and is now a good time to do it? Because right now, we've been kind of sitting on the three major game creators since the early 2000s, and they haven't really fluctuated since then. So the question becomes, if you're Google, is now really your time to strike? Thoughts on this, Logan?
Well, I think we should go take a step back and ask what we think of such a company as Google entering the game market. What is that going to be like? What do they aim to do? And are they more so aiming for the service aspect rather than a traditional console war aspect?
That's a very good point, because I've heard actually speculations on both sides of this. Some people are saying that it's just going to be like outright a stream box. Like
Hmm.
literally like an Amazon Fire Stick for your Google gaming service. Other people have said they're legitimately trying to enter the hardware market while simultaneously offering this streaming service. If it's just the streaming service, then I'm sort of defeated as to why you wouldn't be trying to cooperate with companies like PlayStation and Nintendo that won't don't necessarily have their own streaming services quite as solidified as say Microsoft does, and just work with them to use the hardware that already exists versus making your own proprietary thing. Now granted, maybe it's not proprietary, you can opt to buy it or use your current systems, we don't know yet, but
Hmm.
that would make kind of more sense to me. As for the hardware thing, we're gonna have to dive a little bit into the history of consoles. So I'll let you touch on your part of this for a minute first, and then we'll go there.
All right. Well, you mentioned what time should they enter the console market if that is what their goal is. Right now, we're seeing our last generation really petering out at the moment. So, in my opinion, the playing field is ripe for new platforms to come in and thrive. Many believe that the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X have largely filled their niches at this point, and otherwise don't really seem to be living up to either company's expectations. And so we await the true successor to this generation, being the PS5 or whatever Microsoft Scarlet turns out to be. So if they were to enter the gaming market right now, this would be a good way for them to kick off the next generation of gaming.
True, and I think we live in an era where the generations are becoming a little bit less defined by the day. I mean,
Hmm.
for instance, when we were doing our games pickups here even recently, it dawned upon me that some of the games for the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 era were still being released in like 2014, 2015, 2016, which was
Hmm.
like 3 years ago, when these newer platforms have been around much longer, which means the older platforms aren't necessarily dead, and it just grazed that whole console transition to begin with. That, and we're living in an era with basically three major developers in terms of hardware for video gaming, being Nintendo, Microsoft, and Sony. And Nintendo, for the past two generations, has basically just given the rest of the industry a giant middle finger and said, screw you and your generations, I'm making something new when I want to make something new, deal with it.
That's essentially been Nintendo's whole thing.
Yeah,
They really don't seem to take much of a note or really go off of what their competitors do. They sort of like to do their own thing, as we've seen time and time again. But one thing that does fascinate me, though, is a lot of people are pointing to the fact that this may be one of the last generations that we will even see such a thing as a gaming console. Something like that could potentially be phased out altogether with the population of PCs and, as we've been talking about, other streaming services.
right. So then that kind of brings us back to our Google point. We're dealing with grayer areas in terms of generations, which you're right. If we are talking from a strictly, I'm going to force the term generation onto the way consoles are released type of perspective, then yeah, now's kind of the right time. But if we're heading towards streaming services, does it make sense to dive into the console market for a single generation and then just pull back out again and go back to making stream sticks? I'm not really sure. I mean, it could be like a test run type of thing, and maybe everybody's speculations about the consoles being phased out over time in favor of basically PCs and streaming services may prove to be incorrect. We don't know yet, but it does seem to be a fair bit of evidence in that. It's weird. It's weird. I don't. If I was Google, I'd be leaning more towards that third party support type of aspect just because we've seen what this console industry has done to people before. There have been so many companies that have tried their hands at it. I mean, just to name a few that have absolutely flopped, Tiger and Panasonic are like the first ones that come to my mind. You had the bloody freaking CDI. I'm sorry, that's Philips. So there's another one. You had the Panasonic 3DO, the Philips CDI, and then Tiger, R-Zone, and Gamecom, and other
The
things.
Apple Pippin.
Wait, what? Is that actually a thing?
Yes, Apple made a game console at one point in the 90s. Granted, of course, it wasn't strictly marketed as a game console. It was some sort of multimedia slash entertainment slash online gateway sort of thing, but it came with controllers and game-like software. So yeah,
So, I mean, writing to that respect, we're dealing with a market that, yes, it's opening a lot, especially in terms of game development, and we've seen a lot more success of indie games in recent years than we haven't seen in the past. But when it comes to the hardware, boy, you've got to find a gold mine in order to get in. I mean, and when we look at the companies that did, I feel like traditionally they found a very pivotal point at which rate to join the console market. Looking at the big two who haven't been around forever, like Big Daddy Nintendo right now, Sony chose an era where Sega was in flux, and there was kind of this big push towards 3D gaming, trying out CDs, which was a technology that Sony had more or less mastered, and they kind of took advantage of that. They exploited it with the PlayStation 1 and managed to show off a piece of hardware that was extremely easy to develop for, and it led to them being able to gain a foothold in the market, which they've been able to hold ever since. If you look at the original Xbox, they chose when online gaming was first really becoming a good thing. And they were able to basically exploit that. Hey, we're Microsoft. We make computers. We deal with internet services all the time. Let's hop on this bandwagon while we can. And it worked for both of those companies. If we look at some of these other companies, the transition times weren't quite as distinct, at least in my eyes. Either that or they were swinging for those transition times a little too early. For example, things like the Apple system you just mentioned and the Philips CDI were mostly tagged as being this huge like multimedia platform when the market wasn't really ready for that yet. So, bearing all of that in mind, if we're looking at Google, which is trying to lean in towards kind of like these streaming service types of things, we have to consider if we're at a point where this is as technologically viable as everybody keeps wanting it to be.
that's very true. So we should also look at what they would have to do to gain such a foothold. If we do go back and look at the launch of the PlayStation 1, we'll know that Sony was very kind to developers at that point. That's how they became known as the basically the third party machine that developers flocked to because of their low licensing fees, easy to program for hardware, and at the time, they had one of the mediums that had the most memory, being CDs.
Right, and that made them extremely appealing, and it kind of brings us to the core of what sells a game console. It's not your
Hmm.
hardware. Here's a hint, it's your games.
Yep. So, what do you think Google will have to do to attract developers to whatever they plan on entering with?
Well, that's where I think things get interesting because we're at a point where, and especially just within the time zone where we've been doing this podcast, we've seen a lot of our AAA developers flop on their faces.
Hmm.
So, getting that developer security, I think we'd be in an era where you'd need that third party ease of access again. At which rate, because streaming's so new, I don't know if that's the route you'd want to go because you got to figure if you're an indie developer, you're probably running on what's not quite the most optimal of builds because just a strict budgeting standpoint to get your games put out there. So if you're not able to optimize them for streaming correctly, then they may not necessarily work on the system correctly either, which makes that whole third party system idea a little bit harder to get behind.
Well, you
That
know who's really good at taking things and, uploading them to sort of a network? Google.
That's true. And that's where their first party power can really come into play there. And it would be a matter of developing that relationship early on. And I think this is where a lot of people are actually starting to get intrigued by these rumors of Sega supposedly working with them. Where I
Hmm.
kind of lie on that is I'm not sure how much of a difference Sega would really make at this point. Sega, a lot of their best selling games are either they handled the porting of it from another country, basically the localization, like they did with a lot of the Atlas games that have come out in recent years, or they're basically just remakes, remasters, or reshoots of older games that they've had in the running for a long time. At which rate, if it's the latest entry in the 2D Sonic like new golden age type of perspective on things, I can play that on any other system. It's not necessarily going to draw me to playing that in the first place.
Well, keep in mind that the whole Sega and Google working together is largely just a rumor.
That's true. That's true. So it's not even necessarily the thing, but I guess my point is amongst third party developers with an iconic library that can appeal to a large age range, Sega's still one of the better hitters even after all these years, and I'm not sure they would even make enough of a difference.
That's true. But I suppose we'll find that out on the the conference coming up next week.
Right, right. And that kind of brings up another point. If you're trying to sell games, let's face it, I don't know about you, but like whenever I'm looking at what console I'm going to get for a generation, the first thing I look to are the exclusives. Why? Because most third party games end up making it to most of the platforms. So their overall library nowadays is usually relatively similar, even if there is sometimes a delay between releases from one system to the next or whatever. So I feel like Google would have to secure some exclusive titles, and that would involve managing to get some identifiable and enjoyable intellectual property amongst a market for that that's arguably already a little bit oversaturated to begin with.
Hmm. Yeah, it does make me wonder what they could potentially secure from third parties. Google hasn't proven themselves in this field, obviously, so my guess would be they would probably try and secure the some indie developers.
I could see that, especially considering you've already got something like the Google Play Store, which is arguably,
Hmm.
at least when it comes to mobile games, the best platform to release those types of things on right now. So perhaps they can get some of those mobile developers to work with them on some more in depth titles. I don't know. That's just one possibility for it.
And
So,
that's true because you see, it's hard to sell a console on you can play indie games on it
right.
because you can already do that on most every platform, as indie games typically do not require a large pool of hardware to drain from.
Right, and that's where we get into the issue of most of these consoles have some identifiable exclusive series to help sell them. Xbox, you've got Forza, you've got Halo, you've got Gears of War. PlayStation, you've got things like Uncharted, The Last of Us, Persona, which is basically a PlayStation exclusive at this point. You've got Nintendo with, well, do I even really have to mention Nintendo's lineup of characters? Like, theirs is the most iconic of all, probably. They help to sell the platform because it's like, well, why should I get an Xbone and not just play on my computer? Well, you can play Halo. Okay, fine, type of perspective. Well, what am I going to be able to play on this Google device? I can't just play on my computer or my Xbox or my PlayStation or whatever.
Exactly.
And I don't. The problem is, I feel like Google, despite all of their resources, would be very hard pressed and kind of overstepping their bounds at this point to try and generate those valuable IPs on their own. I feel like they would need to somehow either get somebody else involved or obtain ones that already exist. Which, as you said, they're new in this market. How many people are really going to want to fluctuate away from a company that they know is doing well to this new experimental one, thus losing all of their contracts and reputations with the place that they've been making money with for so long?
Seeing as how big Google is and how involved they are in technology as a whole, they could likely offer incentives to developers who choose to strictly go with them. We've seen this in the past before.
That's true. That's true. So it's weird. We're in a weird spot with it. I mean, Google, I think, my problem is I personally will be am kind of like against the console to begin with, just because I feel like if Google manages to stick this landing into the console market, as much as I like the idea of there being a greater variety of consoles available to consumers, because I think it does good things for the market in terms of innovation and stuff a lot of times, I
Mhm.
feel like if Google manages to stick this landing with a platform that most likely, even if they are going to a strict hardware perspective, probably still has a lot of its core properties based in streaming, that's gradually starting to spell out the doom of real hardware, real software being produced, and just leaning more into the streaming service type of stuff. And it's just unsettling to me. And I think it also kind of, as many issues as I have with the trifecta war in the console market that we have nowadays, I think it has forced all of them to develop an individualized identity. Versus if a company like Google lands a stream box and it does just as well, anybody can just start crapping out a stream box that doesn't necessarily have that individual sense of identity to it.
And of course, there's the whole death of physical media thing to
Of
go with
course,
that.
yeah.
Yeah, I definitely do not want to. I definitely do not want to be paying a subscription fee just to enjoy my games, no matter how. I guess you know they're going to try and when they release this, they're going to try and tout about how it's somehow like a huge bargain, right? Like say it's $5 a month once you buy the hardware. Yeah, that's cheap for all the games you're getting, but at the end of the day, are you really getting the games?
Yeah, because as soon as that service is gone, you literally can't play them anymore.
Hmm.
So, kind of the point I guess that we should probably almost be getting at here is if you're Google, do you take the gamble and try and lean into this streaming technology as much as you can? Go for that bargain price point. Try to offer something that at least appears cheaper and better to your average consumer of, oh, I can pay $95 for this Google stick versus $500 for the PlayStation 5. Or do you go for something that's sort of a hybrid, kind of lies at a lower price point but not so extreme, like say $300 to $350, manages to offer some sort of a physical media usage still, but still leans heavily on this sort of what's it called streaming service? Do you go for that hybrid approach? Which one would you say lean into?
I say Google's going to pick the first one. Definitely. They already have the infrastructure for making those sort of stream-like boxes. Most of the rumors we have about this Google entering the game market involve the Chromecast itself. So they're definitely probably not going to be making any sort of dedicated hardware box. It's likely going to basically be a souped up Fire Stick with a cheap controller.
And speaking of which, we've actually seen the controller designs. They're awful. They're
Cheap,
absolutely horrible.
cheap, generic. Doesn't even appear to include a headphone jack. You'd think this was Apple's controller design.
Yeah, then like that obviously there's a lot of modern conveniences missing from it. And if this was the year like, I don't know, 1996, it would probably be passable. But the problem is controller-based consoles are something that already struggle to get through to a lot of people now anyway because there is such a strong PC-based market. So if you're going to get those people to win over at all, you need a controller that's comfortable, that performs well, that has a convenient button layout, that is recognizable, and that's pretty intuitive in terms of how it works. Problem with this thing is it looks clunky, overly long, doesn't have nice features like a headphone jack that allow you to play your games at night without disturbing everybody else if you live with other people, and those types of things. If it's missing all of those, it's kind of just like, why?
I suppose they want to focus on their. Uh,
Their
I,
own
I don't-
identity.
they clearly don't though. That's why I'm trying to piece together what why they're going to release a controller like this. Because like you said, something that is divisive in terms of platforms is what controllers are available. And this controller, it doesn't look like it's breaking any new grounds. It doesn't look divisive. It's definitely not going to attract anyone to this platform, at least based solely on the controller. The only thing I could think of is perhaps they're going to embrace the fact that perhaps other controllers may be able to work with this. Maybe you can connect your own Bluetooth controller, things like that. But yeah, other than that, it doesn't look
Yeah.
very good for Google with this controller.
And I hate it when companies do that if they are trying to rely on other controllers for one reason, and that's because, or I'm sorry, a couple of reasons. First of which being, then what you're doing is sort of a weird form of advertising where it's, yes, you can play it straight out of the box, but your experience is going to suck because our controller sucks. It's sort of like the old Retron 5. Can play game cartridges from like 7 different systems, right? The controller is
Sometimes.
absolute garbage. Yeah, and sometimes. But and the other thing is, at least in my personal experience, I've found that for whatever reason, even with our modern era Bluetooth controllers, most of the time, like an Xbox One controller seems to have less latency on an Xbox One than it does on any other system. The latency's still low, but not quite as low. Same with like a PlayStation 4 controller and everything else. Now, maybe that's just me, but with that being the case, playing as many games as I do, I notice that slight difference in latency, and I feel like that's because the platform is optimized to work with this specific Bluetooth device. If you're relying on numerous kinds of different third-party controllers, that's not going to be the case.
That's very true. And yeah, more on this Google controller. It doesn't look like it. Oh well, it might have shoulder buttons, just a weird angle.
Yay.
They can advertise that. That's their feature.
Yeah, the weird angled shoulder buttons. It's
Hmm.
awful though. I mean, the controller makes all the difference in the console, in my opinion. It makes a world of a difference. That's part of the reason I enjoy console gaming over PC gaming. Is I love the feeling of the controller in my hands. It adds to that overall sense of identity that controllers can, or I'm sorry, systems can offer. So seeing that's just frustrating.
Yeah. It, fun fact, the first controller to have a headphone jack was the Panasonic 3DO controller.
Really, now that's something.
You wanted me to include that, so there it is.
Yeah, exactly. But I guess the question then becomes is if you're Sony, if you're Microsoft, if you're Nintendo, and you see Google doing this, how do you respond? Do you stick to your old ways of hardware and everything else that runs basically as the current consoles do? Offer some of these streaming service types of things through the console, but it still has all the old features. Or do you gamble everything and go with the Xbox One discless edition like they're trying to do now and try and out Google at this thing?
Well, by going with the discless Xbox One, I don't think they're really taking a gamble. They're still supporting platforms like the Xbox One S and Xbox One X, but they are slow. They're definitely dipping their toes in the whole streaming service debacle, as we've seen with things like Game Pass and whatnot. So they're probably just going to do a slow transition, if any transition, into a streaming service, if that's going to be lucrative for them. But as of right now, what's lucrative for them is what they're doing and what they're doing very well.
That's true. That's true. But a lot of people seem to be speculating that this is sort of the next big thing, this streaming thing, and whoever manages to
Mhm.
capture this holy grail first is going to be at the head of the market by far. It sort of reminds me of how people used to kind of view online gaming. It was whoever could get that right first was going to win that console generation. And that's basically what we saw with Xbox Live. I mean, I mentioned earlier how the original Xbox and the PlayStation 2 era, you saw some of the online gaming, but that was a much more limited, sort of getting their feet wet type of exposure, sort of like what we're seeing with streaming right now.
Mm.
Xbox captured that online gaming idea first in the 360 generation, and that's why they ended up winning that generation, if you ask me, for the most part, in terms of, they didn't win in terms of sales, but in terms of like captivating the audience, it always struck me as them winning. Regardless, moving forward, it's kind of like, is it worth it for these companies to try and do something to compete with Google right off? I mean, there's even an argument I think to be made for maybe because these stream sticks are relatively cheap for the company to make. I mean, that's the reason a lot of them have $100 or less for the price tag. Would it even be worth it to consider making like, well, here's the Microsoft Stream Stick. Also, here's the Xbox Scarlet. You can choose whatever you want, but the Xbox Scarlet's the pro experience. This is the casual experience. Or something like that. Sort of like what we've seen with the pro consoles versus our regular consoles in the current generation.
You could argue that the discless Xbox One coming up is essentially their version of that streaming stick.
Very true. Very true. Do you think we'll see something like that with the next generation?
I definitely think we will, with consoles becoming more focused on online. A streaming service for each platform seems inevitable to me.
Now, what do you think about this in terms of does it affect the rumors we've heard about PlayStation 5 compatibility, backwards compatibility? Because in order for you to have that backwards compatibility without it literally just, hey, here's a bunch of free ISO files you can use to play the games, you need some sort of a disk drive.
I don't think we'll be seeing the disk drive cut off altogether just yet. I
Okay.
definitely think that we're still going to have physical releases because I mean there are a lot of people like us still. A lot of people still want to get the physical releases of games. If
Us old
each
farts still like the games.
Sure, if if every major hardware manufacturer were to cut physical altogether, there would be so much backlash. I mean, remember what happened when Microsoft was trying to launch the Xbox One for the first time, and they mentioned that whole thing about not being able to read used games or something of that sort.
Yeah, not being
Everyone
able
was
to.
up in flames.
Yeah, not being able to be played offline was another one too.
Yeah, that too.
No,
So I don't think we'll be seeing them cut off
right,
quite yet.
right. So while we're touching on this, why don't we touch on the fact that other people are kind of trying to dip their hands into the same thing? Which brings us back to our original question of, is now a good time to enter the console market? And if you're doing what we think Google's doing, is it even really the console market anymore? That's the fact that we've heard things about Verizon launching a streaming service, Amazon trying to dunk in, Google trying to jump in, obviously. I mean, are we watching basically the market fade out and just turn into everything's just this multimedia streaming device system as a whole?
Perhaps, but the one thing that does concern me the most is that we're seeing all these giant tech companies trying to pursue this. You mentioned Verizon and Amazon. Imagine all of them going head to head with Google, things like that. And then we already have Microsoft in here. Uh, I don't know how the gaming industry essentially being run by just a bunch of tech giants really, really makes me feel.
Yeah, I'm not too happy about it either, especially when we consider the fact that with our current big three, yes, Microsoft's a tech giant generally, but that's the reason that they've managed to stay afloat in the market despite basically performing the worst right now.
Hmm.
PlayStation, yeah, Sony's a tech giant too, but their sales in a lot of their other fields have been gradually kind of on a downward turn here for a while. So gaming's become a major focus of theirs for a reason. They aren't nearly on the scale that they used to be, nor are they on the scale of companies like Amazon and Google and Verizon. Nintendo, all they do is games. Like games and merchandising for their games. So if you start having all these huge companies coming into the play, I mean, can these people necessarily keep up if Google decides we're going to throw all of our resources into this? It could simply be a case of they're able to out resource our current well focused console developers. Or, I
Hmm.
mean, one thing that I wouldn't even say is entirely outside the realm of possibility is if one of our current developers starts to struggle a little bit, speaking primarily of Nintendo or Sony, is it possible they could get eaten up by one of these other giants and then just become a pawn for their gaming side of things?
Yikes. I don't think we'll be seeing that from Nintendo or Sony, but it definitely could happen to, I'd say, a company like Activision or Bungie, something like that.
Right. Especially considering Bungie's become kind of smaller by the day, I feel.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, they could easily consume one of those software companies, and that's actually something we didn't touch on before about Google being able to secure these IPs. Is a lot of these independent game studios, they're big, but that's like comparing a state to a continent in terms of the studio versus Google. The
Hmm.
continent could eat up the state pretty easily. At what rate, if they wanted to secure those IPs, they could, and it kind of just speaks to a lot of what we've been seeing in the entertainment industry as a whole, and that
Hmm.
everything seems to be consolidating under these large helmet companies, essentially, that umbrella everything under them. So if that's the case, it kind of scares me a little bit as a gamer because I feel like right now we're in a little bit of a boom in terms of creativity and everything because so many independent studios have found success. But if everybody's funneling under these larger companies everywhere else and these huge names are starting to enter the gaming market, what's to say that won't happen to these smaller companies, these indie groups, these groups like Activision that are big but small in comparison to the larger companies? What's to say they won't just get consumed with everybody else and then basically you have three factions within the field of electronic entertainment?
Oh, I definitely agree. We've seen this happen with sort of Silicon Valley startups a lot of times. One will
Right.
develop something new, and almost instantly it gets eaten up by Amazon or
Yep.
Google or whichever other one feels like having a meal that day.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, we've seen it with the movie industry. How many intellectual properties does Disney own now? They bought Marvel. They had a slew of them that were their own to begin with, and then they've obtained Fox. Yeah, Fox. And like it's crazy, and they're apparently on the talks of trying to obtain more. And I could see a company like Google or Amazon starting to replicate this for all electronics. And the scarier part is, Amazon isn't even just restricted to electronics. Like,
They could start publishing their own books.
oh no, then the Kindles will be the only way to read. No, it's weird, and I don't like it for the games market just because I feel like the more studios we have, the more interesting and creative games we get. I think that's part of the reason the 16-bit era had such a diverse library and interesting games and so many out there things is games were a little bit cheaper to make at the time. You had a lot of platforms available to try and make them for. The market was a lot more open-minded. The smaller we shrink, the more they're under single companies, the less room there is for that. And I think that's been part of the problem, even with the current generation, which I don't think is nearly as bad as it could be. Is there, I mean, yes, there's been an indie boom, but when it comes to AAA games, they seem to be funneling down more and more into being sort of this, I don't want to say single viewpoint on things, but there's like almost like a checklist of things you need to have in your game for it to succeed.
Hmm.
So it's just
Yeah,
scary.
and that's our theme. We're very scared.
We're scared, yeah. I mean, like, maybe that's just me, but I feel like in the 16-bit era, if I were to pull 10 cartridges, it's a lot less likely that those 10 cartridges have a million features in common than necessarily nowadays. And I know some people argue with me, but I would, or allow me to say this, I think it scales better. Because in the 16-bit era, you had many more software restrictions in terms of what the platforms could run. But for the time, they were really pushing a lot of boundaries in that field. Here, it's like, even if we're just looking at our major releases from the past few weeks, there are so many similarities between all of them, from like The Division to things like Crackdown 3 and everything else. A lot of them have those shooter and open world mechanics that seem to be staples across the board, which isn't a bad thing, but that's part of the reason indie games that do those weird things are succeeding, and it just brings me back to if they funnel in, then those indie companies may not be able to do that anymore and everything else.
I don't know. When I pick up a bunch of cartridges at yard sales, they're mostly just sports games.
I mean, I think you're talking about your drink coasters, but
Ah,
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's gonna be interesting to see what Google does. That's for sure. And hopefully, it's nothing too horrible to the industry. Maybe it'll even offer a good budget option for players. And that's, I think, one thing we have been kind of dodging here is the fact that the streaming services, even though we're against them, it kind of does broaden the market because if gaming's more affordable, more people will be willing to try it.
mm-hmm.
Like, I know that's a lot of reason. I know I have friends that just play games on their phones because most of that stuff's free to play. Versus, yeah, I've got Spider-Man, and Spider-Man I can play for frickin' 60 hours, no problem. Your mobile game might last you for 5. But for me to play Spider-Man, I needed a PlayStation 4, which was $250 to $400, depending on where you find it, then a $60 game disc on top of that. Your price tag was whatever you're paying for your phone, which you're going to use anyway. So
Mm-hmm.
$100 is a lot cheaper than that. So it's a cool concept, at least, for the streaming box to be available to people. I just don't want to see it totally consume the market.
I highly doubt it's really going to. I mean, we've seen games be included on Fire Sticks that we've mentioned previously, and games that have even been on Apple TV. This is likely just going to be an extension of that.
True, true, and just a little bit more powerful. I mean,
Hmm.
as far as I'm concerned, I mean, Candy Crush is like the best game of all time. So as long as you got that, no, I'm kidding. But like, you got to consider that level of gaming versus everything else here, man. No, you're right. You're right. It probably won't consume it. So with that being said, that about wraps my thoughts up on this topic. How about yours?
Oh yeah, you summed it up perfectly.
Cool. So let's go ahead and trug right along here to what have we been playing?
Skyrim.
And less pretty Skyrim.
Yep, that's true. Skyrim Oblivion, and I'm trying to get back into Persona 1 on the PSP.
Ooh, good choice. Good choice.
Hmm.
How's that going for you? Because I know Persona had a pretty big change in terms of how those games were structured right around Persona 3.
Yeah, is that big change was mainly just more J-pop.
J-pop and more
Yep.
like life simulator aspects, right?
I suppose with the games that they were developing at that point in time, but this is basically just a port of the original PS1 game. I got lost in a building for most of it, but I got out.
Hey, there you go. That's a true sign of like a game from that era. Is I feel like when they were first introducing 3D games, sometimes they were a little too vague as to where you were supposed to go with things, but sometimes getting lost in the world is half the fun. So
If I find an actual labyrinth in this game, I'm going to be screwed.
exactly. I mean that once more. I think that kind of speaks to the era, as I feel like those games were very vague, which isn't a bad thing, but it was just kind of an attribute of games of that type from around that time.
Hmm.
I don't know. Maybe that's just me. But yeah, how are those games been treating you? Persona 1 especially.
Uh, so far so good. Oblivion runs terribly on the PS3, but that's part of the reason why I love it. And yeah, like as you were saying, Consequence the Era sort of thing. Basically, when you're going through these hallways and stuff, they all look the same. Like there's no paintings or windows or really any markers to tell you where you are. So that really just speaks to the graphical limitations they had at the time. So for that, I can pretty much forgive
Yay! I mean,
it.
you gotta take what you can get for those things. It,
uh,
it's not bad, and it's a port, and it's the PSP, and it's got UMDs, so it's gonna be fun no matter what happens.
and it's portable.
Yeah, and just portable. So, in terms of what I've been playing this week, Final Fantasy 13. Oh
Yeah,
boy, oh boy. I'm like 5 hours into that game, and I still can't decide whether I like it or not. Like, like
it's on the 360 though. How does that make you
I
feel?
just
Part two.
cringe. It's not right to play Final Fantasy on an Xbox. I'm sorry, but
It's
freaking
disgusting.
oh my god. No, it's cool. I mean, it runs well. There's that. There's also the fact that I mean, it looks really nice, especially for that era. Like, if I'm looking at other games that came out in like 2009, 2008 ish, geez, this game blows them out of the water. The world is beautiful. The gameplay, very smooth, but some of the combat mechanics feel kind of weird. The entire game so far just feels like you're walking down a hallway, though. But I guess part of me's sort of okay with that, because I'm also a really big fan of Persona 4, which is a dungeon crawler, and dungeon crawlers mostly narrow down to just walking down a series of hallways. So it's just, I don't know. I don't know.
At least your hallways look pretty.
Yeah, at least the hallways look nice. And then, like, the characters are interesting, and, like, there's a couple of them that are kind of the two leads that are some interesting foils of one another. But at the same time, some of the dialogue, I don't know whether it's because of the translation or what, but feels very cringy. So
Hmm.
I'm really trying to figure out how I feel about this one, man. Right now, it's graphically pretty enough that I'm just kind of watching it and still enjoying it. But I don't know if that'll last for the entire 80 plus hours I'm sure a Final Fantasy game will require of me. So, we shall see. Anything else you
Would
want
you
to
say
cover?
it's worth? Would you say it's worth trying at least?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Because there is a PS3 port.
I mean, especially considering you can get the PS3 port for like $5. Like, go
Nice.
for it. Go for it. For sure thing. But yeah, with all that being said, next week we have one really major game release with Shakiro Shadows Die Twice, which part of me is still considering pre-ordering because some of the pre-order bonuses include this sharp sword-like letter opener that looks really cool. And the game looks pretty cool as a whole too. It's made by the same people that made Dark Souls, so that's a thing.
Ooh.
With all that being said, guys, that probably about wraps it up for this week's podcast. Any last minute comments from you, Logan?
Uh, do you think we'll be covering the Game Developers Conference?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. There's like no doubt. The question is how time relevant will we be when we cover it? But we will be covering it at some point. That's for sure.
All right, very true.
Alrighty. So with all that being said, guys, I think that's gonna wrap it up here. We'll catch you next week.